East Coast Canada is right now at a crossroad. Immigration is surging, housing prices are skyrocketing, and political participation is plummeting to an all-time low in that region. But what does this mean for the future of democracy in Canada? So in this episode with Canadians, I went to the East Coast New Brunswick to discuss leadership, political apathy, and the economic impacts of immigration out there. Is the influx of immigrants boosting the local economy? If it is, then at what cost? I also ask who really benefits from this influx of new residents and who gets left behind. What about the rising housing prices out there that's making life harder for the residents and even the most vulnerable of the people out there? Well, these and many more I discussed with Mike Archibald out there in New Brunswick. If you're new to the channel, please subscribe to the channel and like the video. And watch until the end, where I also bring you a very important announcement which you do not want to miss. Well, there's a lot to be said on this episode. Let's get into it. The major reason we're seated having this conversation is because of your great comments on my videos, right? Which I totally appreciate.
Oh, no problem.
Lengthy, most of the things are right there, but very thought-provoking, I will say.
Well,
And
lengthy,
I thought,
I don't
why
do any
not?
other kind. I don't edit. I have to now. YouTube, I'm much better at brevity because YouTube, I think, just cuts most long comments now. They just cut them out. I'll leave a comment, and then just for fun, I'll go back and check later, and it's just gone. So now it's almost like you can only leave short comments.
The first video where I saw your comment was the one where I talked about the fact that Canada does not elect great leaders. And then you said altogether, the Canadians don't elect leaders, the parties do.
Right.
How does that shape your perception about the democratic system in Canada?
The most democracy would be within the parties. That's why, one of our big Canada has one of the lowest participation rate in political parties in, you can look that up, but OECD or, the Big Nine kind of thing. In New Brunswick, it's, I think, the lowest in Canada. I remember there was about 3 Liberal conventions ago, I saw in the newspaper, we've elected a new leader. And I was wondering, I wonder how much they won by. And I tried to find it, but they wouldn't list it anywhere. And somebody told me they only actually had the hall of a motel rented to pick who the leader was. So that's very small. I think the Conservatives had maybe, I can't even say because I can't remember, but it's a pretty small number. So basically and outside the parties, there's almost no political participation at all, which I would say, the perception of democracy is that, it's pretty much nil. And now what you're seeing is people aren't even bothering voting. The only thing we have, the only political power we really have is to vote. And if you look at the last Ontario provincial election, I think it was somewhere around 50%. Almost half people in Ontario don't even vote. I saw on TVO, they said, Doug Ford is, he's really popular. I'm like, yeah, is he? Or is that just what you're hearing from social media and not from the half of people? Because when I lived in Ontario, when they tried to, in New Brunswick, the Liberal Party tried to sell NB Power, which is the public utility here. And everybody protested. My elderly parents were at the protest in Fredericton to stop them from doing that. In Ontario, they sold most of the public utility. And I think we tried a couple of times to get protest. You couldn't fill a room.
Right. So has that culture changed over time? You observing it over the years?
No, because I think that was always the case. Political participation within parties has always been pretty low. What has changed now here in New Brunswick, it was 2 elections ago where we had a minority government. because the Green Party got 3 seats, and there was a new party called the People's Alliance, and they got 3 seats. And I think that's the first time in New Brunswick history that something like that has happened. We had a minority government with 4 parties. Now, that's supposed to be the norm. That's the norm. We have a minority government in Canada. And that's what really changes things, is when you get a minority government. But the electoral system is designed to not give you minority governments and not to let them last very long. So in New Brunswick, we had that minority government for the first part of COVID, but it was maybe 6 to 8 months, and then we had an election. He got a majority. So it really comes down to the electoral system, because we had the first past the post, the same as Great Britain, same as the United States. And I don't think it's a coincidence that all 3 countries are having the same kind of problem with political participation, because people are just seeing, well, what can you do? You're literally at a...
But that changed. That changed, for instance, in the United States in 2020. I think in 2020 they saw the most participation, where the election that Trump lost.
Well,
that changed.
That's a little bit different, because if you can get like a candidate that's kind of so crazy and so bad, then you'll get a lot more people going, okay, now I have to pay attention. But otherwise, generally, because what you'll find the same thing if it's like they're trying to frame this next one as a referendum on the carbon tax. And generally speaking, when they mention, when there's a single issue that kind of galvanizes the election, then people tend to show up more. And it might also change if they have mail-in ballots, if it becomes easier to vote. Because a lot of people are kind of like, well, what I do doesn't make any difference. But if you have a mail-in ballot, it's kind of like, well, it's here, I'll fill it out and send it in. I'm not going to go to the voting booth and stand in line. But probably between mail-in ballots and the fact that early voting is stretched out, 2 weeks, I think. So, they're making that easier to vote. I mean, if you could get like an armored car, and you could go around and you could have the government, all the voting people that work at the voting booth go to door and say, hey, if you want to vote, you'd probably have pretty high turnout. But most people, apathy is the big word. People get apathetic, and they just kind of like, well, what's the difference? So, but if somebody actually came to their door and said, here's your ballot, you'd kind of like, oh well, okay.
Right. And we don't have that much of mailed-in ballots here in Canada, right? I think the United States
that was
does
the
more
big
of that.
because they started. They just passed that law, and then they tried to, because I hate to be partisan here, but like the Conservatives really didn't like that. They were like, because basically the Conservatives will get in as long as nobody votes. In Ontario, that's how the Conservatives won. Was everybody that voted anything but Conservative just didn't show up. And in Alberta, I think the voting turnout was like 54%. No, it might have been 59%. But you're still relatively low.
Yeah, I suspect that's going to change this time around, though, especially now that the stats are showing now that over 70% of Canadians are kind of disgruntled with the Trudeau administration. But you are not, from the comment.
Canadians are always disgruntled, first of all. But
I think once you've stayed too long in office, the people will get disgruntled.
For sure. But like I say, like right now, if I'm disgruntled with Trudeau, well, every poll shows the Conservatives are going to win anyway. So I don't need to vote. So I can just stay home and it makes no difference. I mean, the other thing is I live in a rural riding, and that's, thanks to Trudeau, who said he was going to change the electoral system. It does, rural people tend to vote Conservative no matter what. And so, I mean, if I was going to vote anything but Conservative, I might as well not even bother voting. Because they're going to, they won by like, I can't remember how many. But now, if I was more involved, like going door to door and talking to people and saying, oh, how are you going to vote? Oh, you're going to vote for the Green Party? Oh, okay, well, but I don't know that. So basically, I vote mostly because my wife makes me. But, it's kind of like, well, I'm in a rural riding. It's going to go Conservative anyway. So, why would I bother? And that's the same. And in urban ridings, they tend to vote Liberal. Now that's starting to change for the exact reason that you're saying. I mean, to my mind, it's kind of crazy that Trudeau is still even there. I don't even understand that because, I mean, if that writing's not on the wall, I don't know what is. I mean, if I had to guess, I would think that they're kind of waiting for the last minute to do like they did in the States, and they'll get this guy that they keep talking about. I can't remember his name. I don't even think he's a politician. But they always keep talking about him. And then at the last minute, they'll do like in the States, and they'll say, well, Trudeau will step down, and this guy will come in. And then the media will go, oh, well, this changes everything, and all that kind of crap.
So you think there is a possibility Trudeau is going to step down?
Well, there's always a possibility. Like I say, I can't even comprehend why he's still there. And me personally,
I'm sure
I don't even
he can't comprehend the reason why he's still in office.
Well, not so much the office. If he was running it, I don't understand why he's leader. Because I mean, when your polls are that bad, in politics, there's always a tactical reason for everything. So my thinking is that, like I said, they might in the States. They just saw that example. All the campaign managers that sit in a room, they're looking at the States, and as soon as this Kamala Harris took over for Biden, like 2 weeks before that change, everybody hated Kamala Harris. And everybody was saying, no, she's the most horrible person. We need this Joe Biden. And then he had that debate. And then like 2 days later, they switched. And now all you hear about is, oh, well, everything's different and they'll vote for him. And so campaign managers in the party will see that. And they'll kind of go, oh, well, that seems to work pretty good. So I would, as a strategist, you would kind of think they're trying to think, okay, well, when's the best time to do that? And it used to be you do it as early as possible. Now it's almost like, well, people hate politicians. It's almost like the less they know about a politician, the more likely they are to vote for him. So like I say, Mark, I can't remember the guy's name, but you're this economist or something.
Oh, yeah, I'm going to look it up. I'm actually not aware of that.
Carney. Mark Carney? Mark Carney might be his name. He used to be a governor general or something, and they keep talking about him. And but I don't even think he's a liberal. I don't even think he's in the party. But like the liberals don't care because they'll nominate. 2 elections ago they had that Michael Ignatieff, who was like a Harvard professor that nobody heard of, and they're like, you'll do. But this Mark Carney guy, he was a fairly well respected economist or something. So they'll dump Trudeau, bring him in, and oh look, everything's changed. And the Globe and Mail will say, oh well, this is great. This changes everything. And I mean, personally, if I was a liberal strategist, that's what I'd do.
All right. But you mentioned in your comment, though, that Trudeau's administration has been good for the Maritimes. Why do you say that?
Well, for one thing, it's not me that said it. It was our premier, our conservative premier, basically said all I mean, it's just a fact. It's just a simple fact that as far as the government,
the conservative premier, though,
what was that?
You said the conservative premier was the one that said that? The current Trudeau's administration is good?
Because somebody said, well, why is the economy doing so much better? And he said, well, because Trudeau has doubled transfer payments and because of immigration. And those are both federal. I mean, he certainly didn't say, oh, we have Trudeau to thank. But the reasons that he gave of why New Brunswick is doing better was immigration and transfer payments. We were getting double the transfer payments that we were when Trudeau started, and immigration has just changed everything here. Like Moncton in 10 years is a completely different city from when I moved here. So I do my shopping, I do it at immigrant stores that have prices that are way better than the chain stores. Now, if I was in rural New Brunswick, I obviously wouldn't have that advantage. But economically, if you're an economist, in fact, right now, Blaine Higgs is saying, you can't vote Liberal. Don't change anything because we're on a roll here. Everything is great, from his perspective. Now, if you're homeless in an encampment, that's a completely different story. But, economically speaking, the Maritime, the New Brunswick's books have never been in this good a shape. Not in my lifetime, and I'm 55. So if you look at New Brunswick's surplus, they had so much surplus, they were like, well, we don't know what to do with this because we've never had this much money before. But,
Well,
of course,
I think that's one metric in the economy, though, when you look at the surplus. And I'm aware of this also that Nova Scotia as well, for the first time after the Conservative Premier took over, they had a surplus. I don't remember which year, but this was post-COVID. That was
right.
actually after relocated. But there are many factors. One is the influx of immigrant, like you say, but if you look at the net positive for the whole immigration story, it's a lot more nuanced than talking about budget surplus, right,
Oh,
for
it's
the
always more
government.
nuanced. But
Yeah.
I'm actually talking from a conservative point of view. Like,
Right.
I mean,
Okay.
because I mean, it's certainly not better when you're talking about, like, poor people living in tents. I don't mean
Yeah.
that. But I mean, in Moncton, in downtown Moncton, there's probably 6 abandoned buildings, like old industrial buildings, huge buildings that could house every homeless person in Moncton. No problem. You can house people, every homeless person in Moncton, no problem. In fact, it would be less of a problem because there's a charity here that bought like an old building, an old curling rink, and they said, well, it's an old building. What we'll do is that we'll at least have the tents indoors.
Right. So you're referring to that kind of building as a low cost housing option, right, for homeless people.
Right.
Is that right?
Oh, well,
Um,
for low cost housing, well, here's an example. Moncton just got, you can look that up, a whole bunch of millions of dollars because they applied to
I
the
know.
federal government for this
Hmm.
project for affordable housing, to build housing in Moncton, which they've done
Hmm.
nothing about for like 8 years. But, and so then people ask the premier, oh, well, are you going to match that? Are you going to increase provincial billing? And he said, no.
Right.
We want to make a law so that cities can't apply to the federal government for money. That's what we want to do. And, you read this stuff and you think you're on Mars. It's like, wait, what? What? Because, I mean, they got a whole bunch of millions of dollars for affordable housing. And the premier's response was, well, yeah, we want to make sure they can't do that. We want to make sure that they can't get money from the federal government for housing. I mean, to me, that's just crazy. So per your point about housing and people in tent cities, well, that's not Trudeau. Housing is provincial, and our provincial government could house everybody in New Brunswick, no problem. The government could buy any one of the old Co-op Atlantic building. Is like a 8-story building that could have probably about 400 apartments in it by the end of the month. And like I say, the province has bucket loads of money that had that huge surplus. And then people said, well, why aren't you spending it on housing? He's like, well, no, we need to be frugal. We need to pay down our debt. And there's all these other issues. Road work here took off this year. They put a ton of money into road work.
I'm certain you're enjoying this interview right now and you can't wait to get back into it. Revaluate is a project I embarked upon to spark meaningful conversations that can inspire critical thinking as we navigate the adventures of life. The analytics on this channel show about 95% of the viewers on the channel haven't subscribed yet. So you do me a favor by clicking the subscribe button right now. Then I'll keep my promise to continually improve on the quality of the conversations that are produced on this channel every time. So please click the subscribe button right now and let's get back into the conversation. Right. And the way I will interpret that is, if you compare that, for instance, with Ontario, and this is one of the arguments I have with some of my friends who are pro-immigration to whatever extent, almost like a pro-open borders, which I'm not an ounce pro-open borders at all. But the argument I have with them is, with the influx of immigrants, 1.2 million people in 1 year, in 2023, that came into Canada, one, we can talk about even the UN report that showed that this is modern day slavery. I read the entirety of that report, for instance. And then I look in the city, driving here in Ontario, it's never been this chaotic driving in Ontario. And you look at the infrastructure, how much can it even support the number of people you're bringing in? And I think it's the same thing when you think about a place like New Brunswick, right? You have the influx of immigrants, you have the inter-province migration that we were talking about earlier on, almost 10,000 people that migrated in 1 year. And then you have immigration, which is about the same number. And then you have it's a younger generation of immigrants coming in for the most part, right? So that means the workforce is increasing.
Right.
The resources, the infrastructure must be able to support that. So maybe that's why government will prioritize road construction over low-cost housing in that case. And if you just one more point there, like if you look at the fundamental reason why homelessness would increase, right? Usually there is an underlying condition. It's not just because, oh, people ran broke. For the most part, usually there is an underlying condition, drug addiction, mental health problems, and the like. That's why the average person will end up on the street right now in Canada. Oh, looks like you're going to disagree with that. I'll let you go for it.
I would say that might be true here, but in Ontario, I would argue against that because they're literally saying, like, I saw an interview with this guy. He was a construction worker, and he was like saying, "I just can't afford rent. I have a full-time job, but I just can't afford a place to live. Simple as that." Now here, I would probably, and that's why I say here in New Brunswick. I mean, I've never done a poll. I would tend to, because there's basically different social strata. Okay, there's the guy in the tent. There's people that are precariously living. They don't have much money. They're going from friend's house to friend's house kind of thing. But wages here have always been a problem. So, I mean,
Sure.
but I would agree more with that if we had had a government that had brought in rent control. Because at the lower end, most of the people are renting. And here we had no rent control. So during COVID, this was pre-immigration. There was no, hardly anybody was getting into Canada. We were locked down. And what had happened was in New Brunswick, about 6 apartment buildings got sold to foreign investors who literally jacked up the rent overnight because there's no rent control because they can't. And they just did, and so there was people that their rent increased 50%, and then people people stop, buying things, and people make do in order to not lose their house. But that's all money that's now gone. Now it's just gone to foreign investors who own those apartment buildings. Now they did that with the hydro rates didn't increase at that time. Interest rates were. They were giving money away at that point. So it wasn't that. It was literally selling a building to a foreign investor who jacked up rents because they could. That's it. For profit, essentially, is what it is. So for all those people, that's a different story. Now, the homeless people that have mental illness and drug addiction, now it's pretty obvious to me that the first step is you need to give those people a house. Simple as that. The saying is you can't get off drugs while you're living on the street. And your mental illness isn't going to get better while you're living on the street. So it's housing is that issue for them.
Right. So I think in tandem with that will be, as housing is provided, I think programs should actually be provided as well to get people permanently off the street, right? Programs to help them with addiction problems and their mental health issues as well. So let's begin to wrap up like this. So you've seen many generations of political systems in Canada. And okay, let me actually ask you on this. What's your perception about the net positive or net negative of immigration, even on the East Coast? Do you think this has really worked well for immigrants and for the systems? What do you think? And let me add on top of that, the culture of the nation, because that's a complaint that a lot of people have out here in Ontario, how it's actually shaping the culture generally in the nation. What do you think about that?
Well, number one, like you were talking about, basically the idea of if you want free trade, you have to have free mobility of labor. That's economics 101. If you're pushing free trade, you have to have free mobility of labor. That's part and parcel if you're pushing for free trade. Now, I'm not a big fan of that. And I've never said, I don't know of anybody that says, well, we should have open borders. I've never met anybody that said that. Like I said, immigration, on the selfish side, immigration has been great because I've got all these stores where I got cheaper prices. I've got food. I can buy Moroccan food and I can buy, there's more people, which means other businesses. So it's not all, there's also a store on Mountain Road that's owned by a farmer. Well, if you go in there, they're almost all immigrants there that are buying the food because he gets them pretty cheap, and he's got great produce for great prices, and and because of where it's located, that's basically a heavily, a lot of immigrants live there. So, like me personally, I think it's fantastic. As a political tool, that's completely different. Because somebody would say to me, okay, if you were in charge, what would you do? Would you have this massive influx of immigration? Well, federally, we needed to. Because, you can look this up if you want, but Canada was paying CPP payments out of general revenues, which is because there were so few workers during COVID. They talked about this during Parliament, where they're like, well, we're kind of really screwed here in Canada unless we have a whole lot of immigrants. Because our pension payments weren't being paid by workers. They were being paid by tax dollars, which, they couldn't. But you never hear about that in the media. You only hear about, all the other stuff. But, I would have never managed immigration like this. That's just crazy. In Trudeau's first term, he went around the world bragging about Canada's privatized immigration system. That's what he called it. A privatized immigration system. Industry was controlling how many people got, industry and churches, essentially, were controlling how many people got in. Now, what people would say is, well, there's lots of people here. Well, if wages go up, then, okay, how would you manage the system? Well, you've got drug addicts and you've got people with mental health problems. Well, if you put them in a house, they might, try, and they can work part-time. And then they might get better, but companies would have to accommodate them. And of course, companies don't want to accommodate people. I worked at a cannabis factory and, stripping cannabis. And, that would have been ideal for like somebody who was homeless or mentally ill. They'd come in for like a few hours a day and, strip buds kind of thing. And you could do that. But the company doesn't want that. They're like, well, that's a pain in the ass. They essentially let me go because I wasn't going to work 12 hours a day. I said, 12 hours? That's crazy. But they brought in Filipinos. They brought in people from Indonesia that aren't going to complain about wages. And that keeps wages down. And, that's what they want. But I would never do
Which is essentially the reason why the UN report is showing that this has actually become a modern day slavery. Because wages are no longer as regulated as they ought to be. In fact, you find places
and that's
where,
always been true. And here, like I said, during COVID, wages actually went up here. So, and I think that was without legislation. Like, this is a conservative government. They're not raising minimum wage. I think they eventually raised it a bit. But wages went up during COVID. So, from that perspective, people were like saying, oh, well, this is pretty good. Wages went up for the first time. And the other point is, the other reason the Maritimes benefited was because of Ontario. Because there's so many immigrants, there's almost too many for Ontario. So a whole lot of them stayed here, who normally would have moved to Ontario. Now, as soon as housing gets sorted out in Ontario, like they're building all these new apartment buildings, but wages here have always been the lowest in Canada. So the immigrants are eventually going to do the exact same thing. As soon as housing, clears up, they're just going to move. And then you could say, okay, well, then maybe will the economy sort itself out? But it's a crazy way, to manage a society.
Okay, so let's wrap up on this. You've mentioned that a vote that is not for conservatives in the upcoming elections is probably a vote that is thrown to the wind.
No, I didn't mean that. I would never mean that. basically you have a vote. Here's your level of apathy. Now,
hmm
right now, conservatives are, the ones who are voting are very
Right,
angry. They are going to vote.
right,
I think
right.
it's even a poll. You can look that up. They did a poll of intention
Right.
to vote. That's what they call it. And like
Yes.
for conservatives, it's way up. They will vote. If you're not voting conservative, now I know a lot of people are starting to kind of get, they kind of get scared of conservatives. So so their level is going to rise. But for the voter intent for anybody, because like you say, the dissatisfaction with Trudeau is even high amongst liberals. So why would, if I was going to vote liberal, why would I vote liberal? Because they've got a leader I don't really like.
Well, I think the factor in which people are getting scared more and more of conservatives, I think, in my opinion, is more of a populist rhetoric. And a part of it also will be the fact that media generally has actually become a tool for liberals. And let me even say a tool for left-wing ideology. Every study shows that actually, that media has turned really left-wing in the last many
No,
years.
what studies have you
Oh,
seen that say media
well,
is left wing?
Don't forget, I had a podcast recording where you actually commented this last time too. The professor, the political scientist, who talked about the fact that actually media is increasingly becoming left wing, or left leaning, I should say. That was the
No.
language he used. And I read a bunch of articles. I think we'll come back to this conversation. Let's not go into media. This will be a very good conversation for us to come back later on and have.
That's a big. I would, in fact, I would probably say the media is our probably our biggest problem. But I would certainly not say that liberal is left leaning. If you're not conservative, you might see it as left leaning because it's not right wing. But Canada's always had like maybe 5 media companies. That's pretty much it. So if you read the Globe and Mail,
would
there's
you?
no way in any rational world somebody can say the Globe and Mail is left leaning. That would be outright crazy. I would say you'd have to be nuts to think that. The Globe and Mail is
Well,
pretty much evil.
I will let people talk about that in the comment section, and you and I will come back later
Okay.
to have this conversation about media. But what do you want to see for political reforms if a new administration is coming into office, or even if Trudeau retains power, or whoever the Liberals want to put up takes power? What do you want to see in
Well,
the immediate?
what I would think is I'm pretty happy right now. You've got a prime minister who's not very popular, which is fantastic. I'm not big on leaders. Leaders are great for China, or you might like Putin or something like that. I want a weak leader. That's what I want. I want a leader that in New Brunswick, that's probably the only plus of the liberal area. Most people don't even know who she is. That's a good thing because because it costs $30,000 just to run for liberal leadership. So she owes a lot of favors. So what you want is a liberal party around her that's like, you're hanging on by a thread. You have to actually listen to us. Because
What do
here
you
our
mean, though? You
president
want a
says,
weak leader?
oh, a weak leader, absolutely. Well, I mean, what's a strong leader? Isn't a strong leader a dictator?
Not exactly. Strong does not mean dictatorship. I think strong means visionary. It means having the power to,
Having the
the
power.
willpower.
Having the power.
Having the willpower. No,
Right.
willpower, not power. Well, every leader has power, but having the willpower to do the will of the majority, maybe in the democratic system, and visionary leaders. Those are strong leaders. Why would you want a weak leader? One that is tossed around by the populists in their parties? Is that what you mean by weak leaders? One that dances to the tune of
like I say,
international
a leader,
organizations?
You're talking about one person having a vision and implementing that vision, which is the literal definition of a dictator. One person with a vision who has the power to implement that. That's what a dictator is.
So why do political leaders present their manifesto, their vision, when they're coming into office?
Well, they pretty much have to. I mean, that's what media says. That's what media wants. That's why everything revolves around the media.
No,
because
but if you
like I
don't,
say, right
if you don't
now,
have a vision, then you become a little, pawn on the board that anybody can toss
well, we're all
around in the
pawns.
party because you're surrounded by a lot of
Democracy is a board of pawns. Democracy is everybody is a pawn. And how you have to realign society is how do all those pawns get along? That's what democracy is. Everybody has equal power. Everybody is a pawn. Now, that's a perfect analogy. Is like you're saying, well, we're going a king and a queen who are super duper and they have a power, and we're just pawns. That's not
no,
democracy. That's never been
no.
democracy.
I think strong leadership is now how you manage the voices from those pawns on the board. Otherwise,
Well,
each
no, that's
one
not
would pull
democracy.
you in different
Democracy,
directions.
the pawns can do that themselves. Pawns getting together can do that themselves. You can have a referendum. All the pawns vote. You have a referendum, is done. That's what Switzerland does. Everybody gets. There's towns in Switzerland where everybody shows up once a year. I was just watching one the other day. They were deciding whether to have a swimming pool. The whole town is there. Should we have a swimming pool? Everybody raised their hand. Okay, 70% wanted to increase taxes to buy a swimming pool. Done. Everybody's a pawn. Everybody voted. Your idea of a visionary would be somebody who thinks he knows that. He might be the guy who only listens to people who are saying, no, we don't want a swimming pool. I don't want my taxes going up. But he's a visionary. No swimming pool. And then those 40 people, 40% might be very vocal. So you might think that. But we have a minority government. That's fantastic. Because what happened was the conservatives had an idea. They said, we don't want the carbon tax to apply to farming fuels. And the NDP supported that. So it overrode what the Liberals, with their vision, we want a carbon tax on everything. And they said, well, no, we don't want it on farmers because we need food. And the NDP said, yeah, they're right. Let's not have it on that. And that got in because the Liberals they're not the visionaries. They can't get their vision in completely. They have to compromise. And that's what you want, is a compromise. You want political parties.
Well, we're gonna take that as our last point for the dialogue today.
Oh,
but
I enjoyed it.
It's been really good chatting with you.
Yeah.
I'm gonna leave the decision to people in the comment section, especially about the later part of the conversation. But I don't want it to make it too long so that it's easily consumable for people out there. Permit me to pause this conversation for a quick moment, and it's my honor to bring you a very important announcement. My goal through this channel is to help as many people as possible navigate the complexities of life and that of modern society. From deep down my heart, I believe in the rights of everyone to individual prosperity and even the common good of the larger society. That's why I do the monologues on this channel, and I bring expert insights from the guests that I invite on this podcast. So generally, podcasts like this will invite experts, the big names out there who already have some public presence and interactions, and they will share their thoughts over long-form content. I like to do that. But I also love to hear from people, especially Canadians and beyond, who may not even have a Twitter account, who's never written a book or an article online before. And because of this, I launched a series of interviews on this channel so that no matter who you are, whether you be a carpenter, an electrician, an engineer, a stay-at-home mom, no matter what your age or your skin color is, whatever you do, wherever you live, and whatever your political preferences or affiliations are, it doesn't really matter. I want to hear your thoughts, your perception about the trajectory of our nation, Canada. And if you live outside of Canada, but if you have an incredibly inspiring story, did you bounce back from a major setback? Did you pull through some adversities? And did you overcome a major obstacle in life? Are you looking to get that story out, to encourage someone out there? If this sounds of interest to you, I need you to do two things for me right now. First, subscribe to the channel and give this video a thumbs up. And then second, please comment your thought about the video you just watched right now. And in the comment section, please add the hashtag Revaluate Podcast. My goal is to have as many interviews as possible, maybe once per week in this category. And I would really love to hear from you. If you do those two things, like the video, subscribe to the channel, and write a comment about your thoughts about the video you just watched right now, and add the hashtag Revaluate Podcast. And then I will reach out to you personally, and you and I will be talking on this channel. Well, thank you very much for hanging out with me this time around. I'll see you very soon. Take care. Bye-bye.